During a single day of fighting, dozens of unmanned aerial vehicles were shot down, several tanks and rocket launchers were destroyed, and one key Russian fire support link was disabled within seconds. While this engagement did not lead to immediate territorial changes, it highlighted a deeper shift taking place across the Ukrainian battlefield. Increasingly, modern combat outcomes are shaped less by the number of tanks or artillery systems deployed, and more by control of low-altitude airspace. According to available reporting, Russian forces launched concentrated waves of UAVs with a clear operational objective to overwhelm Ukrainian defenses and locate the drone units directing precision strikes on the ground. These were not isolated reconnaissance missions. Multiple UAVs advanced simultaneously along similar routes and altitudes, applying sustained pressure to test the limits of Ukraine's detection and response systems. Ukrainian units were not caught by surprise. Radar coverage, reconnaissance drones, and ground observation posts identified the incoming UAV formations early, allowing countermeasures to be activated before the drones reached frontline positions. This early detection proved decisive. Rather than responding to sudden threats, defenders were able to anticipate movements, track flight paths, and time their responses deliberately. As the UAVs entered contested airspace, the engagement shifted from isolated interceptions to a broader contest of detection speed and coordination. The density of the drone formations, intended to overwhelm defenses, instead made patterns easier to identify. Overlapping routes and repeated flight profiles allowed Ukrainian operators to prioritize areas of activity rather than pursue individual targets. In effect, concentration reduced uncertainty rather than creating it. Ukrainian responses were layered. Some UAVs were intercepted directly, while others were monitored to identify control points or supporting elements. Ground observers played a critical role by confirming movements and spotting low-altitude approaches that radar coverage alone might miss. The objective was not to destroy every drone immediately, but to disrupt the rhythm of the attack and force each system to operate under constant pressure. This phase illustrated how UAVs now influence combat beyond their strike capability. Each launch revealed intent, and each movement generated data. According to analysts, the side that processed this information more effectively gained control over the tempo of operations. By the end of this stage, it was clear that effectiveness depended less on the number of drones launched and more on how well their movement could be managed under observation. A notable development during this engagement was the reported involvement of Ukrainian F-16 fighters in counter-UAV operations. Ukrainian aircraft were observed engaging a Russian Lancet drone, signaling a shift in how air defense is integrated across the battlefield. Rather than being reserved for separate missions, manned aircraft were operating within the same detection and response network as drones and ground observers. This integration altered the tactical environment. Attack drones that rely on stable approach paths and predictable flight profiles faced new risks. The presence of fast-moving aircraft reduced the margin for error, forcing UAV operators to adjust routes, altitudes, and speeds. Some drones flew lower to exploit terrain masking, while others slowed to reduce detection. However, these adjustments introduced new vulnerabilities, increasing exposure to ground fire or extending time spent in defended airspace. The fighter aircraft did not operate independently. Interceptions were guided by radar cues, drone feeds, and visual confirmation from the ground, reinforcing a layered defense structure. This reduced the gaps that UAVs often exploit and placed additional pressure on attackers to make early trade-offs between speed, concealment, and survivability. While the use of fighters for drone interception carries limitations related to cost, endurance, and risk, analysts note that their involvement during this phase demonstrated that low-altitude airspace is now contested by multiple overlapping systems. The result was not the end of UAV operations, but a gradual reduction in their freedom of movement. The third phase of the engagement underscored another evolution in drone warfare, the use of FPV drones as aerial interceptors. Ukrainian FPV units actively tracked and pursued incoming Russian UAVs, engaging them before they reached ground targets. These interceptors launched rapidly, positioned themselves along likely flight paths, and relied on speed and maneuverability rather than payload size. This development transformed the low-altitude airspace into an active zone of aerial contest. Russian UAV operators faced the increasing likelihood that each launch could be intercepted by a smaller, faster drone already positioned along its route. This reduced the effectiveness of flying below traditional air defense coverage. FPV drones proved well suited to this role due to their low cost, rapid deployment, and short response cycles. When hostile UAVs were detected, nearby FPV teams could be tasked immediately, closing distance before targets reached their objectives. As more attacking drones were intercepted, pressure on Ukrainian ground units eased, reducing exposure for artillery crews, armored vehicles, and command posts. Attempts by Russian UAVs to adapt by flying lower or taking longer routes introduced additional risks without resolving the underlying problem. Analysts note that each adjustment traded one vulnerability for another, further diminishing the effectiveness of mass drone launches. Cost dynamics also played a role. FPV drones are significantly cheaper than many attack UAVs, meaning defensive losses were less consequential than the loss of attacking systems. This imbalance favored defenders, allowing sustained pressure without rapidly depleting resources. Over time, the logic of mass UAV assaults weakened as increased density made patterns easier to detect and counter. The final phase highlighted the impact of persistent aerial surveillance on ground operations. Russian armored units, including T-72 tanks, advanced cautiously while firing towards suspected Ukrainian positions. Despite efforts to use terrain and vegetation for concealment, repeated anti-tank strikes followed once their movement routes and firing positions were identified. Each strike reduced mobility until one vehicle was ultimately disabled and destroyed after multiple impacts. This sequence illustrated a broader trend observed by military analysts. Once armored units are fixed under continuous observation, their survivability declines sharply. Mobility, once a strength, becomes a liability when movement can be tracked and targeted in near real time. At the same time, Ukrainian T-64 tanks operated according to a different tactical rhythm. These vehicles maneuvered under ongoing artillery pressure, firing and repositioning in short cycles that limited the opportunity for effective counterstrikes. Rather than holding fixed positions, crews emphasized timing and coordination. Engagements were brief, with withdrawal beginning before return fire could be fully organized. According to battlefield reporting, this approach relied less on armor protection and more on situational awareness, supported by observers who warned when exposure increased. Survivability was achieved through movement rather than endurance. As armored engagements continued, Russian infantry units attempted to regain momentum by shifting to lighter forms of mobility. Small groups used motorcycles and all-terrain vehicles to move quickly across open ground, aiming to shorten exposure to artillery fire and avoid predictable routes. In theory, speed offered flexibility and reduced time spent under threat. However, once aerial surveillance remained active, this approach introduced new vulnerabilities. Light vehicles produced clear visual signatures, and their lack of protection left little margin for error once detected. FPV drones were able to respond rapidly. Operators tracked moving groups, followed their routes, and conducted strikes as distances closed. Some infantry attempted to disperse or abandon vehicles and seek nearby cover, but these reactions often occurred too late. Drones adjusted faster than personnel could reposition, breaking groups into smaller and increasingly isolated elements. What began as a rapid advance frequently degraded into fragmented movements with limited ability to regroup. This pattern repeated across the sector. Assaults that depended on speed lost effectiveness once persistent aerial observation remained in place. Movement attracted attention rather than reducing risk. Vehicles intended to minimize exposure instead made detection easier. Analysts observing these engagements note that the logic favoring rapid advance weakened under continuous tracking, where faster movement often led to earlier identification. The combined effect on Russian operations was significant. Armored units hesitated after observing how quickly firing positions were identified. Infantry slowed once light mobility failed to provide protection. Coordination suffered as units waited for safer opportunities that did not materialize. Momentum declined even in the absence of a single decisive engagement, as delays consistently favored defenders. What stands out is not only the destruction of equipment, but the sequence that preceded it. Detection occurred first through persistent surveillance. Fixation followed when units slowed or clustered. Precision strikes then arrived once timing favored the attacker. This sequence consistently punished attempts to rely on speed alone. A clear breaking point in this phase came with the destruction of a BM-21 Grad multiple launch rocket system. The launcher was neither moving nor firing at the time of the strike. It had halted in a tree-line area while awaiting reload and refueling vehicles, a routine step following a fire mission. Ukrainian surveillance. Drones had been monitoring the area and tracking the launcher after it completed its salvo. Once the system remained stationary, an FPV drone was directed toward it with precise timing. The strike hit while rockets were still on board, triggering a secondary explosion that destroyed the launcher within seconds. Multiple rockets detonated in succession, eliminating the system before the crew had an opportunity to relocate. Beyond the physical loss, analysts note the operational impact of removing an active fire support node. BM-21 systems typically function as part of a broader artillery network that includes other launchers, support vehicles, and coordinated command elements. The loss of a single launcher in this manner disrupted planned fire missions and created immediate gaps in coverage. The effect was felt quickly. With the Grad no longer providing saturation fire, Ukrainian positions faced reduced indirect pressure. Movement became less risky, and units were able to reposition more freely. The shift in tempo reflected the loss of a tool used to shape the battlefield from a distance. The consequences extended beyond this single strike. As attention shifted, additional Russian systems came under pressure. Self-propelled artillery units that attempted to fire and displace were detected during movement windows. Armored vehicles covering withdrawals drew drone attention when crossing open terrain. Infantry elements retreating toward tree lines or structures encountered escape routes that were already under observation. The sequence remained consistent. Persistent surveillance enabled detection. Slowing or stopping led to fixation. Precision strikes followed once conditions were favorable. This process did not rely on mass firepower. Small unmanned systems carried much of the disruption, while ground units adjusted to exploit the resulting openings. The earlier loss of the Grad amplified these effects by removing a system that could have suppressed or delayed responses. This phase highlights a growing vulnerability of heavy fire support systems that depend on periodic pauses to operate. Reloading and refueling are unavoidable requirements. In an environment under constant aerial observation, these moments become points of exposure. The Grad was not destroyed through counter-battery fire or direct engagement, but by a low-cost drone exploiting stillness. By the end of this stage, the pattern was clear. Firepower that cannot move without detection faces increasing risk. Systems that stop under observation may quickly become targets. The destruction of the BM-21 did not only remove a single launcher, it illustrated how modern battlefields penalize reliance on concealment without control of the air. Taken together, this sequence of fighting reinforces a broader trend observed by military analysts. The battlefield in Ukraine is increasingly shaped not by the quantity of tanks or artillery deployed, but by control of low-altitude airspace and the ability to dictate tempo on the ground. Dense UAV activity, layered air defense, FPV drone interception, disrupted armored movements, and the rapid loss of fire support systems all reflect a recurring cycle. Detection leads to fixation. Fixation enables precision strikes. Ground forces then consolidate based on the space created. In this environment, systems that hesitate, reload, or remain exposed under observation can become vulnerable within minutes. Published loss figures may serve political or informational purposes, but they also point to a broader shift on the battlefield. Cost no longer directly translates into battlefield advantage, and higher-priced systems do not guarantee survivability under persistent observation. Analysts note that the balance increasingly depends on awareness, timing, and control of the airspace closest to the ground. The key question moving forward is not simply how many unmanned systems each side can deploy. It is whether Russian forces can protect fire support assets and restore reliable freedom of movement while operating under continuous surveillance. If not, the expanding role of drones may continue to reduce the time and space available for maneuver. For now, that outcome remains uncertain. This uncertainty is what makes the current phase of the conflict significant, as it highlights how modern warfare is adapting to new constraints and technologies. If you find this analysis useful, consider liking the video, sharing it, and subscribing to Military Force for ongoing coverage of modern military systems, battlefield developments, and the strategic context behind them.